everyone, welcome to Watch It Played. My name is Rodney Smith, and in this episode, I'm going to show you how to play the 4 to 6 player game Tomorrow by Conquistador Games. In the world of tomorrow, overpopulation and consumption has left the world's political leaders and scientific community with no alternative but to engage in the radical depopulation of the planet in order to save humanity from extinction. To this end, nations will engage in cyber, military, and biological warfare in an attempt to reduce the world's population to a sustainable level. But only one nation will emerge as the new superpower. Will it be you? Well, you'll have to play to find out. But for now, join me at the table and I'll show you how to set up to play. Here we have the game set up for 6 players. On the game board, you will place the population pawns by color and amount as indicated in the various locations on the map. For example, in the European Union, you're going to place 7 of the yellow population pawns, each representing approximately 70 million people. Players will be working to remove these pawns from the board to reduce the population of the planet, but presumably focusing more on their opponent's pawns than the people of their own nations. This is the death marker, and it starts on the X, located here on this area of the board known as the threat track. These are disease cards, which are shuffled and placed face down. The event deck actually has 12 cards, but you shuffle and then randomly remove 3 of them from the game, returning them to the box. In this way, you never know exactly which events will occur. There are also 3 strategy decks in yellow, red, and brown, which are shuffled separately and then placed face down. Each player needs to pick a major power that they will control. Now in a 5-player game, no one plays as India, represented here by the purple pawns. And in a 4-player game, the Arab Caliphate is also not claimed, represented by these green population pawns. Each major power has a unique symbol, like this one here. So once chosen, each player should then collect the corresponding turn order marker, as well as the nuclear damage, military control, and cyber markers, along with the action cards for that power. You should also collect a player aid card as well, and ensure that all of your markers are in the face-down position like this at the start of the game. The neutral nuclear damage and military control tokens, along with the die, should be placed near the board as well. The player controlling China now collects the Cybercard and then secretly chooses one of their cyber markers to place face down on it. You'll notice that each marker has a unique face. Finally, the player is dealt a number of disease cards matching the number found here under Bio on the player aid card. Now let's define a couple of terms. First, there are 6 playable nations, and these are known as major powers. Each solid outlined area on the map represents a territory, and each major power has a home territory that's marked with their symbol. I've removed the population pawns for the home territories of India and China so that you can see they are further divided up by these dashed lines into regions. There are also other nations on the board like North Africa and South America that are unplayable minor powers. Tomorrow is played over 9 turns, during which players will deploy various attacks in order to depopulate the planet, which will move the death marker down the threat track through this yellow zone following the arrows. Once it reaches the end, it will loop around and then head through the red zone and finally down the black zone. If the death marker has not reached this final space by the end of that 9th turn, all the players lose, as humanity will not be able to sustain itself. That said, if the death marker does reach the final space, the game ends immediately and players will score. The player with the most political capital at that point is declared the winner, emerging as the new superpower in the world of tomorrow. Now each turn is broken into 5 phases that all players participate in, starting with the event phase, where you will reveal the top card from the event deck. Then the event on the card matching the colored zone of the death marker's current position is resolved. So in this case, the death marker is in the yellow zone, so we would resolve the yellow event, Massive Quake. Next, we move on to the Cyberspace Phase. This allows the player currently holding the Cybercard to take one of 3 available actions. First, they may collect a strategy card from the pile that matches the color of the zone the death marker is currently in. So at the start of the game, you'd be able to collect the top strategy card from the yellow deck. Alternatively, you can steal a strategy card from another player. Simply pick the player you want to steal from, pick the color of strategy card you'd like to have, and then within that color, randomly take one of their cards. The final option you have is to override the European Union player's special power. Each major power has very similar action cards that can be played later in the turn, like we're seeing here when looking at the Chinese and European Union players' action cards. However, each major power does have one unique card that provides them with a special power. Some of the special powers have a permanent effect, so those cards are played and kept face up during the game. For example, the effect of the European Union's special power allows them to set the turn order when players are resolving their actions. So the player holding the Cybercard, which at the start of the game is China, has 3 possible actions during the Cyberspace phase. As we said, they can collect a strategy card from the appropriate deck, they can steal a strategy card from another player, or as we just learned, they can take the privilege of being able to assign the turn order during the action resolution phase, which is coming up, from the European Union player. So after the Cyberspace phase is done, we move on to the action allocation phase. Here, each player will take all of their action cards, pick 2 of them, and place them face down in front of them. This is very important because you'll only be able to use the cards you selected during the action resolution phase. The rest of the cards you won't be using. And once you've picked your 2 cards, you can't change them. Then we move on to the action resolution phase, and now the European Union player, or the Cybercard holder, if they chose to activate their power, will now get to dictate who resolves their first action. They will do this by taking the turn marker of the major power they want to go first and placing it on the turn order track in the first position. That selected major power will now have to either resolve one of their action cards or pass, retaining both of their action cards. The player dictating the turn order will then choose the second major power to go, placing their turn marker in the second position, and so on, until each player has had a chance to either play an action card or pass. Then all players have a chance to pass or take a second action following the turn order that was already established in the first round of turns. We'll go over these action cards in more detail in a moment, but I want to point out each card either has an action, a response, or both an action and a response. Actions are activated when you play the card during your own turn, whereas responses are activated when you play the card outside of your own turn in response to something else that another player is doing. The key, though, is that you may only use actions or responses from the 2 cards you chose during the action allocation phase. And once played as an action, a card may not also be played as a response, and vice versa. Now, something to keep in mind, if during your first opportunity to play an action card, you instead choose to pass, hanging on to both of your cards, well, when you get a second chance to play an action, you won't be able to play both. You'll still have to pick just one of them. A final note here, if the turn order is being established, and it's not complete yet, but the player who's dictating the turn order is the Cybercard holder, and they lose the Cybercard to another player, then the ability to dictate the remainder of the turn order reverts back to the European Union player. It doesn't go to the player who just took the Cybercard. All right, after the action resolution phase, we then move on to the refresh phase. This is where all exhausted cards and tokens get refreshed. Here's an example of some exhausted tokens and cards, and flipping them over is how you refresh them. Also, the player with the Cybercard may again secretly choose which cyber marker goes on the card. We're going to see how military control markers are placed on the board in a moment, but during the refresh phase in turn order, this is an opportunity for each player to return any military control tokens they want to their hand. This will exhaust the token until the next refresh phase, but they may also add military tokens to the board in locations where they already have control tokens. Players can also gather together their used and unused action cards in preparation for the next turn, where they will once again be picking 2 action cards to play. And we're going to go over those action cards in detail, but first I just want to explain to you the strategy cards. Remember, players collectively are trying to reduce the world's population down to the last spot on the threat track. If they succeed in doing this, one of the players will emerge as the victor for having the most political capital. And strategy cards provide another way of gaining and losing that important political capital. As we saw earlier, the player holding the Cybercard can use its power to draw strategy cards during the Cyberspace Phase. But all players can gain strategy cards if they control minor powers with population pawns on them anytime that the death marker leaves one zone for the first time and goes down to the next one. To control a minor power, you have to have at least one of your military tokens in that territory. So, as an example, China has control of North Africa, South Africa, and South America. So if the death marker fell far enough that it then crossed into the red zone here, China would collect a strategy card for North Africa and for South America, but not for South Africa because it has no population pawns remaining on it. And you collect strategy cards from the deck matching the color of the zone that was just completed. Unless a card says otherwise, you can look at it, but you keep it face down in front of you so others can't see it. If you resolve the requirement of the card, then you can flip it face up. Some are also one use, and once used, you discard the card. But keep it nearby. You're still going to be able to keep it because at the end of the game, any political capital points marked on the card, you will then add or take away from your score. Now, one of the key functions of playing these action cards is that they will allow you to remove population pawns from the board. And when you are responsible for removing a population pawn, collect it and keep it in front of yourself. This is a reminder that you had the resolve to do what needed to be done to reduce the world's population and help humanity survive. And these pawns will add to your points at the end of the game. After annihilating a pawn, you will then move the death marker down the threat track a number of spaces based on where that population pawn came from. Certain territories, because of their consumption and pollution, are going to have a greater global effect when they're removed from the map. The chart here will help you keep track of these effects. So when you remove a United States population pawn, you're going to move the death marker down 3 spaces. Whereas if you removed an Australian, which falls into the category of all others, you would only move the death marker 1 space. Alright, now let's go through each of the standard action cards that each player has access to, and we'll start with the biologicals. When playing this action card, you have to pick one of the 2 actions listed on it. The first allows you to unleash a disease, immediately placing one of your disease cards face down on top of it without showing anyone or declaring a target. This gives the other players a chance to block this aggression, perhaps by using an espionage card, as we will see later. If your action is blocked, you take your disease card back and place it at the bottom of the disease draw pile. If no one blocks you, reveal the disease and pick a target anywhere on the board. For this example, let's say the player had targeted South Africa. Each disease card is going to have a name and then a dividing line. Above the dividing line is the immediate annihilation. So this tells us that we remove 2 pawns from the target location. Sometimes you'll see a fraction, however. This tells us that we should remove 1 pawn for every 3 in the target location, rounding down. So in this case, we would remove only 1 of the pawns. The numbers below the line represent the potential spread of this disease. For each adjacent location to the target location, roll the die. This is the symbol for 1. If the die's value falls within this range, 1, 2, or 3, then the disease is going to spread. And in that adjacent location, you will remove 1 pawn for every 3. We have a total of 8 pawns here, so rounding down, we will remove 2 of the pawns. After the disease card is resolved, you then discard it. Also remember to lower the death marker and to collect the pawns you destroyed. We removed 3 pawns from a minor power, and we can see that each one will reduce the death marker by 1 space. So we're going to move this down a total of 3. Alternatively, you may play the biologicals card for its other action, which allows you to draw 2 disease cards from the deck. When drawing disease cards, you're not allowed to have more than 5 in your hand at a time. Alright, now let's take a look at the Nukes action card, and these do vary slightly amongst the major powers, but it's marked right on the card what they do for easy reference. When you play a Nukes action, place one of your nuke damage tokens in the targeted territory. If there are any military control tokens, exhaust one of them and return it to its owner. Next, remove a single pawn from the target location, and then one additional pawn for every 5 now remaining. So in this case, we would remove one more pawn. At the end of the game, each nuke marker will cost the attacker 3 points of political capital, as well as the victim if they still control the territory. If this was the end of the game, no one is controlling this territory. So the aggressor, the United States in this case, would lose 3 political capital for using this nuclear attack. Nukes are devastating to humanity's future survival. When using a nuke, you do not lower the death marker for each pawn removed. Instead, you increase it by a total of 3, moving it backwards 3 spaces. Next, let's look at the espionage action. This, like the biological card, can be used in 2 different ways. The first is to block biological, terror, or even other espionage actions. Let's say someone at the table was to play a biologicals card with the disease face down. Even though you don't know the target at this point, you may play an espionage card to cancel this attack, as long as the espionage card was one of your 2 selected cards and it hadn't been used yet. That said, someone else could then immediately play an espionage card to block your espionage card, allowing the initial attack to go through. So the key thing to note here is that you can use espionage to block an attack even if you're not the target of that attack. And negotiation is another important part of this game. So when you see that biological attack coming, you might turn to another player and say, listen, we both know that attack's going to be targeted at you. I could step in here and help you out, but why don't you leave my population alone for a couple of turns? So making and breaking deals can be important. One thing to point out, though, that biologicals card has 2 different actions, one to play a disease, one to draw disease cards. You can't use espionage to block someone trying to draw disease cards. Now, I did say you could use espionage for something else. It has another special effect that isn't printed on the card. If, during the Cyber Phase turn, someone uses the Cybercard to try to steal one of your strategy cards, you can then use your espionage card to block that theft. You can even use that card if it isn't one of the 2 that you had selected. If you use it this way, though, you will only be allowed to play 1 action card during your turn. Here is the cyber action card, and when you use it, reveal one of your cyber markers, and then the player who possesses the cyber card now reveals their marker with the matching key symbol. If the defender did not reveal the cyber marker on the cyber card, then nothing happens, although the rest of the players now know which marker is on the cyber card for possible future cyber attacks that turn. But let's set this back for a moment and say that we've been a little more fortunate and had chosen this marker instead. Since the revealed marker is on the cyber card, now the attacking player immediately claims the cyber card. And if they have any unflipped cyber tokens, those are then placed on the cyber card. If, when taking control of the cyber card, the player had only had flipped tokens, then nothing would get placed on the cyber card, meaning this cyber card would go to any player that attacks you, no matter which symbol they flip over. But remember, your tokens do refresh at the end of your turn, and as the cyber card controller, you can pick which token to place on the card at that time. The final basic action is military, which can be played as a standard action on your turn, or out of turn as a response. The standard action allows you to invade a minor power anywhere on the board by announcing the target you are invading and placing any number of unexhausted military control tokens there. Keep in mind, you may never use this action against the home territory or region of a major power. For example, you cannot use a military action against any of the 3 regions that make up China's home territory, or against the Arab Caliphate home territory. Now this is interesting because the Arab major power has another location on the map that starts with some of its pawns on it, but this location does not have their home territory symbol, so it can have military actions used against it just like any other minor power on the board. When a military action is played, other players who also selected the military action card during the action allocation phase and who have not used it yet may play it into that military action to either support the attacker or defender. It may also be used to help bolster the defenses of a territory that had no markers in it when it was first attacked. Now let's say when the United States had used a military action against South Africa, China had already had 3 of its military control markers there. Ideally, you always want to have more control markers than your opponent. So is this a bad choice? No, because the United States had already negotiated a deal with India, who agreed to play their military card as a response and then add 2 of their control markers to help the United States player. Once all players have had a chance to play military actions as responses into the contested area, it's now time to check markers for exhaustion, because exhausted markers are always returned immediately to their owner. To do this, match all markers played by the losing side, which is China in this case, to markers played by the winning side, exhausting the winning side's support tokens first. In this case, India is the support. So we're going to match 2 of these China tokens to 2 of these India tokens. They get exhausted and immediately returned to their owners. Then we match the remaining China token to the remaining United States token. They're exhausted and removed. This leaves the United States with a token in South Africa and in control of this minor power. If there had been a tie for control markers between the attacker and the defender, then all of those markers would have been exhausted and removed from the map, meaning that South Africa would have returned to being an uncontrolled minor power. So that is all of the action cards, except for the unique action cards each major power has. Like the European Union that we saw allows them to always dictate the turn order unless the Cybercard owner uses their power to override it. You will find that each unique power is explained on the cards themselves, with any additional details you may need explained on a single page in the rulebook. But for now, let's take a look at endgame scoring. If the players manage to move the death marker to the final space on the threat track before the end of the 9th turn, then they have collectively saved humanity. However, one player will emerge as the new superpower in the world of tomorrow and win the game. To determine that winner, you need to add up all of the political capital for each player, and we can do this by referring to the player aid card. First, depending on which major power you are, you will score a certain number of points for each pawn that remains alive within your home territory. For example, the United States will receive 3 victory points for each pawn remaining in their United States home territory. In this case, the United States would collect 9 points of political capital. Then add 1 point for every 2 pawns in minor power locations that you control, rounding up. So in South Africa, the United States will collect 2 points because there were 4 pawns remaining there. You then add 1 point of political capital for every 2 pawns you destroyed, rounding up. So in this case, the United States player managed to destroy 9 pawns, they would collect an additional 5 points. Now add and subtract political capital points found on event and strategy cards that you have, even strategy cards that you might have discarded for their one-time effect. The political capital points will be located within the fists shown on the card, so in this case, we gained 4 and lost 2. Don't forget to subtract 3 points for each location you control with a nuke damage marker on it, and for each nuclear weapon that you launched. So in this case, the United States would lose 3 points of political capital for having launched a nuke into South America. Ties are then resolved from top to bottom using the winning card. So amongst the tied player, whoever has the most points for keeping their pawns alive within their home capital will break the tie and win. If there's still a tie, go down to the next section, and whoever has the most points for pawns in controlled minor powers will win the game, and so on down the list. Just a couple of final notes now. When the death marker reaches the last space of the threat track, players will then draw cards from the level 3 strategy deck for each minor power they currently control that still has population pawns. Also, if the death marker reaches the very top of the threat track, then humanity is doomed and everyone loses. This can happen especially if people get throwing their nukes around too early in the game. In case you're wondering about these neutral markers, they're put into play by certain strategy card effects. Also, there's no player elimination in this game, so even if you lose all of your population pawns, the influential leaders of your nation continue on, allowing you to play action cards on future turns, weakening other players and maybe even winning the game. Now, I did say you could not play military actions to invade a player's home territory. But that's not to say you can't use nukes or biological weapons against them in their home territories. Something to keep in mind. So that's everything you need to know to play tomorrow, but I did want to mention something else. If you backed this game on Kickstarter, then you'll also be receiving these additional wooden pieces. Let's take a look at them just for a moment. These upgraded components replace the nuke damage markers, military control tokens, and even the death marker itself. If you'd like the upgraded components but weren't an original Kickstarter backer, I'm told you'll be able to pick them up separately. Just check the Conquistador Games website for more information. And if you have any questions at all about how to play tomorrow, please don't hesitate to put them in the comments below. I'll gladly answer them as soon as I get a chance. But until the next episode, thanks for watching.